At 8:47 on a Saturday night, while I was negotiating the last unresolved section of a $184 million contract, my CEO fired me for missing his dinner. 2 sentences, no call, no warning. Just an email from Human Resources saying my employment had ended immediately because I had failed to demonstrate the level of personal commitment expected from senior leadership. At 8:51, my company email disconnected. At 8:53, the contract document vanished from my screen. At 8:56, the client's general counsel asked why the message he had just sent me had bounced back. I looked at the 12 faces on the video call: the client's chief operating officer, their procurement director, 2 outside lawyers, our implementation team, our finance lead, and 3 executives who had spent the previous 16 months telling everyone that this was the most important deal in company history. I took one breath. Then I said, I need to stop this discussion. I have just been informed that I no longer represent Betrayal Systems. Nobody spoke. The client's general counsel leaned toward his camera. Effective when? According to the notice, immediately. He removed his glasses. Then we cannot continue this closing call. At 9:06, the client placed the deal on hold. At 9:14, our chief financial officer called me. At 9:22, Human Resources called me. At 9:31, the CEO who had just fired me called for the first time. I did not answer. Not because I was trying to punish him, because 12 minutes earlier, he had ended my authority to speak for the company, and unlike him, I understood that words inside a contract mattered. What Adrian Cole had forgotten was that the client had not merely asked me to attend the closing, they had named me in the transition schedule. Replacing me required their written approval, and Adrian had fired me in the middle of the final approval meeting because my chair at his dinner table was empty. By Monday morning, nobody at Betrayal was discussing the dinner. They were trying to save the largest contract the company had ever negotiated, and the person they needed to explain it no longer worked there. My name is Claire Bennett. For almost 9 years, I worked in enterprise partnerships for Betrayal Systems, a fictional cybersecurity and cloud resilience company headquartered in Boston. I was not the person who appeared in launch photographs. I was rarely quoted in press releases. I did not stand beside the chief executive when a contract was announced. I was the person who made sure there was still a contract to announce. This story is not about hacking a former employer, stealing a customer, deleting a file, or setting a company on fire. I did none of those things. I left every document where it belonged. I sent no confidential information to myself. I contacted no competitor. I made no threat. I simply stopped acting for a company that had told me, in writing, that I no longer had the right to act for it, and that was enough. Before I explain how one dinner invitation reached the boardroom, subscribe if you enjoy stories about people who protect their integrity, even when their employers do not protect them. Because the most expensive mistake Adrian made was not firing me. It was assuming that my work could be separated from the trust required to finish it. I grew up in a house where promises were treated like physical objects. My father repaired commercial elevators. He kept index cards for every building he serviced, even after the company gave him a tablet. On those cards, he wrote which doors dragged in humid weather, which motors overheated during power fluctuations, and which property managers waited 3 months before paying an invoice. My mother ran the front office of a small dental practice. She could tell you which insurance company would deny a claim because one box had been left blank, and which patient needed to be called twice because the first reminder would frighten them. Neither of my parents had impressive titles, but when something stopped working, people called them. That shaped me. I never believed competence needed to be loud. I thought good work announced itself through the absence of disaster. A system ran, a customer stayed, a deadline passed without panic, a promise was kept. After college, I moved into enterprise software sales, although sales was never an accurate description of what I did. Selling a complex service to a major organization is not one persuasive conversation followed by a signature. It is months of competing priorities, security reviews, insurance requirements, procurement rules, budget approvals, technical demonstrations, implementation schedules, liability negotiations, executives promising things that engineers must later deliver. My strength was translating. I could sit with a chief information officer who feared a security failure in 40 hospitals, then walk into a product meeting and explain exactly which promise we could make without creating a future crisis. I could listen to lawyers argue over 8 words in an indemnity section and identify the operational problem hiding underneath them. I did not charm rooms. I reduced uncertainty inside them. Betrayal recruited me when the company had fewer than 300 employees. Its software helped large organizations coordinate cybersecurity alerts, protect cloud backups, and recover essential systems during disruptions. The technology was strong, the commercial discipline was not. Salespeople promised launch dates before implementation reviewed them. Product leaders described planned features as though they already existed. Finance discounted services without calculating the cost of supporting them. Then, 3 months after I joined, a large customer threatened to leave because the agreement said one thing, the sales presentation said another, and the implementation team had received a third version. I spent 11 days rebuilding the promise. I created a single responsibilities chart. I placed every commitment beside an owner, deadline, cost, and approval source. The customer stayed. The chief operating officer began inviting me into complex renewals, then into disputed renewals, then into deals nobody wanted to inherit. By my 5th year, people had stopped asking what my job title meant. They simply forwarded me whatever could not be allowed to fail. The North Star Health Cooperative opportunity arrived on a rainy Wednesday in February. North Star was a fictional network of 42 hospitals, hundreds of outpatient facilities, and several research centers spread across 6 states. They were replacing a patchwork of cybersecurity tools with one coordinated resilience platform. The winning provider would manage alert coordination, backup verification, emergency communications, and a multi-year transition involving thousands of systems. The initial estimate was $90 million. By the time North Star expanded the scope, the potential value had reached $184 million over 7 years. It was more than revenue. Betrayal was preparing for a major financing round. North Star would demonstrate that our technology could support a complex, highly regulated organization at enormous scale. Every investor presentation mentioned the opportunity without naming it. Every quarterly forecast contained a line labeled Strategic Enterprise Expansion. Everyone inside the company knew what it meant. Adrian Cole called me into his office the week North Star issued its final request for proposals. Adrian had become CEO 18 months earlier. He had been an exceptional fundraiser. He remembered investors' children's names, sent handwritten notes after meetings, and could explain a complicated product in one sentence. He also believed every business problem could be solved through urgency, confidence, and a better slide deck. He closed the glass door. "Claire, this one has your name on it. That depends on whether we can deliver what they're requesting. That is why it has your name on it." He pushed a thick printed proposal across the desk. "You understand cautious clients. They trust you. What authority will I have? Whatever you need. That needs to be written." He smiled. "You always ask for the least romantic part of the promise. Written promises survive enthusiastic meetings." He authorized me to lead the commercial work stream, coordinate final terms, and serve as executive transition sponsor if we won. That last role mattered. North Star had suffered through a disastrous vendor transition 2 years earlier. The sales executives who made the promises vanished after signature. New people arrived, schedules changed, costs increased. North Star therefore insisted that the leaders who negotiated the implementation remain accountable during the first 6 months. They wanted names, not departments, not titles, people. My name appeared in the personnel schedule beside 3 others, our Chief Technology Officer, our Implementation Vice President, and our Clinical Security Specialist. Any replacement had to be disclosed. North Star could review the substitute's experience, interview them, and withhold approval if the transition risk was unacceptable. That did not make me permanently irreplaceable. It made replacing me a process. And processes take time. Adrian approved the schedule. Our general counsel approved it. Our chief operating officer approved it. Julian Pike, our chief growth officer, approved it. Then everyone moved on to the glamorous pages showing revenue, expansion, and market share. I kept working on the pages, explaining who would actually deliver the promise. For 16 months, Northstar occupied almost every part of my life. I learned the client's organization floor by floor. Which hospitals had recently upgraded their systems? Which facilities still depended on older technology? Which executives could approve a change? Which committee met only once a month? Which risk officer would not accept a verbal assurance when a written control was possible? At 6:30 most mornings, I met our technical team before their regular work began. At lunchtime, I joined Northstar's procurement calls. At night, I converted the day's disagreements into decision logs so nobody could later claim they remembered something differently. The deal nearly failed in May when a product executive promised Northstar that we could complete the first deployment in 4 months. Our implementation team needed 7. Adrian wanted me to preserve momentum. That was his phrase for finding a polite way to make an impossible statement sound temporary. Instead, I asked Northstar why 4 months mattered. Their chief operating officer, Elaine Voss, explained that 2 major insurance renewals depended on demonstrating progress before year-end. They did not need the entire deployment. They needed specific controls implemented at 8 priority hospitals. That changed everything. We designed a phased launch. 8 hospitals in 4 months. The remaining facilities over the next 9. The client received what it actually needed. Our implementation team received a schedule it could defend. The deal survived. In August, it nearly failed again over liability. Northstar wanted protection broad enough to cover consequences outside our control. Our insurer would not approve it. For 3 weeks, outside counsel traded increasingly hostile drafts. I asked both sides to stop debating the headline number and list the events they feared. Northstar feared that Verelion would fail to notify them quickly during a serious incident. Our insurer feared responsibility for failures caused by Northstar's own systems. We separated the risks. Notification obligations became stricter. Shared responsibility language became clearer. The liability section became narrower but more usable. The deal survived again. Then came the staffing dispute. Finance had priced the account using a support model that assumed most work would be remote. Northstar's regional teams wanted named specialists physically present during the first deployments. Finance said it would destroy the margin. Northstar said remote promises had failed them before. I built an alternative model using rotating launch teams, regional training, and a smaller permanent presence. Nobody received everything they requested. Everyone received enough. That was my work. Not winning arguments, finding the shape of an agreement people could live inside after the celebration ended. Adrian praised the deal constantly. He praised Julian's commercial energy. He praised product's innovation. He praised finance for protecting value. When someone asked who was managing the negotiation, he said, "Claire has the details." It sounded complimentary. After several years, I understood what it really meant. The details were where he placed work he wanted completed but did not want to see. Adrian did not dislike me at first. I think he respected me in the way certain leaders respect a fire extinguisher. Useful, reliable, best kept against the wall until something began smoking. Our conflict started when he introduced what he called visible leadership. Senior employees were expected to attend dinners, weekend retreats, charity events, investor receptions, and informal gatherings at his home. Some were legitimate business events, others were loyalty tests with expensive food. Adrian believed trust was built socially. He was not entirely wrong. Relationships matter, but he treated attendance as proof of commitment, even when people were absent, because they were doing the work those relationships were supposed to support. Julian Pike understood Adrian perfectly. Julian was smart, polished, and socially effortless. He could enter a room knowing nobody and leave with 3 invitations. He remembered wine preferences. He laughed at the right volume. He made nervous executives feel interesting. He was not incompetent. He was simply strongest at the beginning of relationships, while I was strongest when those relationships reached the difficult part. We should have complemented each other. Adrian turned us into symbols. Julian represented energy. I represented caution. Julian was commercial. I was operational. Julian created excitement. I asked what the excitement required. One Thursday, after I challenged an implementation assumption during a leadership meeting, Adrian asked me to remain behind. "You were right," he said. "That sounds promising. But you were right in a way that slowed the room. The room was approving a deadline we could not meet. You could have handled it privately. The deadline was being approved publicly." He walked to the window. "You need to understand executive presence." I thought executive presence included preventing executives from approving false assumptions. It includes knowing when the correction creates more damage than the error. That sentence stayed with me, not because it was wise, because it explained him. Adrian believed perception was the first reality. I believed reality eventually collected its debt. 3 weeks before the planned North Star signing, Adrian's assistant sent an invitation. Founders Table, an evening of leadership and gratitude. Saturday, 7 o'clock. Adrian's home in Weston. Spouses welcome. Attendance expected for all senior commercial leaders. The dinner celebrated Virelian's 15th anniversary, although the actual anniversary had occurred 4 months earlier. Adrian had recently renovated his dining room and wanted investors, executives, and several early employees seated together beneath a framed copy of the company's first incorporation document. Under normal circumstances, I would have attended. I had attended dozens of events I did not enjoy, because relationships were part of the job. But on Thursday afternoon, North Star's general counsel informed us that its risk committee had moved its final review to Monday morning. 3 issues remained unresolved: the incident notification wording, the transition staffing schedule, and the governance section identifying who could approve changes during implementation. If we resolved them by Saturday night, the committee could recommend signature on Monday. If we did not, the review would move to the following month. That delay would push the transaction into a new budgeting period and force North Star to reconsider several implementation dates. I called Adrian. "The final closing session has moved to Saturday at 7. He was silent for a moment. "You mean the dinner?" "I mean the North Star session. Have Julian cover it." North Star requested the people responsible for the open schedules. Julian hasn't been negotiating those sections. He is Chief Growth Officer. That does not give him 14 months of context. Then brief him. I can brief him on decisions. I cannot transfer the client's confidence in 48 hours. Adrian's voice changed, not louder, colder. "You have missed 2 leadership dinners this year. One was during the North Star security workshop. The other was when my mother was admitted to hospital. I am not questioning the reasons. I am identifying a pattern. The pattern is that I attend business obligations and family emergencies before social events. This is not social. Then move it." He exhaled slowly. "That response is exactly the issue. I should have softened it. Not because I was wrong, but because I knew how Adrian heard disagreement." I tried again. "Let me join the first hour remotely. I can greet everyone, then move to the closing call. No laptops at the table. Then I will come after the closing session. Dinner begins at 7. So does the negotiation that determines whether we sign the largest contract in company history. And I am telling you that leadership is more than one contract." I looked at the invitation on my screen. Of course it is. That is why I am protecting the company's ability to deliver the contract after it signs. He ended the call with one sentence. "Make the choice you believe reflects your priorities." I did. Saturday began at 5:40 in the morning. North Star's lawyers sent a revised governance schedule. Our implementation vice president objected to a section that allowed the client to delay a deployment milestone if a named transition leader changed unexpectedly. Finance objected to the cost exposure. North Star objected to removing it. By noon, we had 2 alternative drafts. By 4, 1. At 6:35, I changed from a sweatshirt into a navy blouse, although the call was remote and everyone had seen me look worse. At 6:52, Adrian's assistant texted, "Seats are being finalized. Confirming you are not attending?" I replied, "Correct. I am joining the North Star closing call scheduled by their counsel. Adrian is aware." 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. At 7, the call began. Elaine Voss opened it. "We have one objective tonight. Produce a document our risk committee can recommend without qualifications. No speeches, no celebration, just work." At 7:18, we resolved incident notification. At 7:43, we completed the implementation staffing table. At 8:05, we reached personnel continuity. North Star wanted my role listed for the full first year. Verelion wanted 6 months. We proposed 9. North Star accepted, subject to replacement approval and a 30-day overlap where reasonably possible. At 8:22, Julian joined the call from Adrian's dinner. I could see candlelight behind him. He was wearing a dark suit and looking uncomfortable. Adrian asked me to observe. Elaine nodded. "We are nearly finished." Julian glanced at the draft. "I'll defer to Claire on this section." That was the correct answer. At 8:31, Adrian sent me a message. "Call me now." I replied, "Currently speaking in closing session. I can call during the next break." At 8:34, "This is the break." I did not respond. At 8:40, Elaine asked whether our chief financial officer had approved the final implementation reserve. I opened the approval email. Yes, approval was issued yesterday, subject to the schedule we have now completed. At 8:45, our outside counsel began reading the final language aloud. At 8:47, the termination notice appeared. For failure to demonstrate leadership commitment. For repeated refusal to participate in required executive functions. Effective immediately. My first thought was not anger, it was authority. Could I still speak for Verelion? The notice answered that question. No. At 8:51, the document closed. At 8:53, my email stopped working. At 8:56, North Star's general counsel noticed the bounce. And at 9:06, the largest deal in Verelion's history stopped moving. Elaine did not shout. That made the silence worse. "Claire, are you able to rejoin under another company account?" "No." "Has Verelion appointed a replacement?" "I have received no such information." "Were we informed that a personnel change was being considered?" "I cannot answer that on behalf of Verelion." North Star's general counsel Daniel Cho spoke next. "Do you have any continuing authority to negotiate these terms?" "Not according to the notice I received." "Then we need to suspend." Julian turned away from his camera. I heard him speaking to someone at the dinner. Then he returned. "Can everyone hold for 10 minutes?" Daniel shook his head. "This is not a technical interruption. The person identified as transition sponsor has been terminated during the closing session. We need written clarification regarding authority, personnel continuity, and whether the representations made tonight remain approved." "Our approvals remain approved," Julian said. "Are you authorized to confirm that?" Julian stopped. He was Chief Growth Officer. He had broad commercial responsibility. But the final delegation document had named specific approvers for the unresolved schedules. Julian was not one of them. "I will have counsel respond," he said. "That would be appropriate." Elaine looked at me. "Claire, thank you for stating the situation clearly. You should leave the call." I nodded. "I agree." That was the last thing I said as a Verelion employee. I disconnected. For several seconds, I sat at my dining table, looking at my own reflection in the black laptop screen. Beside me was a bowl of soup I had reheated twice and never touched. My phone began ringing. First, the chief financial officer. Then the head of human resources. Then Julian. Then an unfamiliar number I later learned belonged to a board member. Then Adrian. I answered none of them. Not yet. I opened the termination email on my personal phone and forwarded it to an employment lawyer I had used years earlier to review my compensation agreement. I did not forward the client document. I did not possess the client document. It had disappeared with my access, exactly where it belonged. Then I wrote one message to Human Resources from my personal account. I acknowledge receipt of the termination notice. Because my employment and delegated authority ended during an active client negotiation, please direct all questions regarding the North Star matter through company counsel. I will not communicate with the client or act on Verelian's behalf unless a lawful written arrangement is established. I added, my personal belongings may be collected by an agreed representative. I do not authorize access to my personal devices or accounts. Then I put my phone on silent. I did not sleep, but I did not call Adrian. At 6:12 Sunday morning, Julian sent me a personal text. I am sorry. I did not know he was doing this. I believed him. Julian benefited from Adrian's preference for visible leadership, but he was not cruel. More importantly, he was not foolish enough to think 16 months of negotiation could be downloaded into his brain during dessert. At 7:04, he sent another message. They want me to take over North Star. I did not respond. At 7:51, I told them I can lead the commercial relationship, but I cannot certify the transition schedules you negotiated. That message mattered. Julian could have pretended. He did not. At 9:30, Verelian held an emergency call with North Star. I know what happened because the events were later described during the board review, not because I had secret access. Adrian joined. The chief financial officer joined. Our general counsel joined. Julian joined. Elaine and Daniel represented North Star. Adrian opened with an apology for an internal communication issue. Daniel corrected him. This is not a communication issue. Your named transition sponsor ceased to represent your company during closing. Adrian said the decision was unrelated to North Star. Elaine asked when Verelian had planned to notify them. Adrian said the replacement would be Julian. Daniel requested Julian's transition qualifications, availability commitment, and written delegation. Julian answered honestly. He had participated in executive reviews, but had not led the implementation, liability, or governance negotiations. He could manage the commercial relationship. He could not explain every operational compromise embedded in the schedules. Elaine asked whether the outgoing transition sponsor had conducted a handover. Adrian said there had been no handover because the employment decision was immediate. That answer ended the call. North Star issued a formal notice at 10:44. Closing would remain suspended. Verelian had to provide a complete explanation of the personnel change, a proposed replacement, evidence of equivalent experience, a transition plan, confirmation that all prior approvals remained valid, and assurance that the change did not affect implementation capacity. They gave Verelian 5 business days. Adrian had expected to punish one absence. Instead, he had created a new closing condition. At 8:03 Monday morning, my phone showed 31 missed calls. Not hundreds. Not thousands. 31. That was enough. 7 from Human Resources. 5 from Julian. 4 from the Chief Financial Officer. 3 from General Counsel. 2 from Adrian. The rest from numbers I did not recognize. At 8:17, my lawyer called. Do not speak to the client, she said. I haven't. Do not send yourself anything. I didn't. Do not explain the contract from memory to anyone who has not established who they represent. I won't. What do you want? That question was harder. I had spent 16 months imagining the signing. Not because of the commission. My compensation included a completion award, but money was not the only attachment. I knew the North Star team. I knew our implementation people. I knew how much work had gone into creating a plan that would not collapse after signature. Part of me wanted to finish. Another part wanted Verelian to experience exactly what it had chosen. I don't know, I said. Then do nothing until you do. At 9:05, Verelian's general counsel, Priya Nandakumar, sent a formal request through my lawyer. The board's audit and risk committee wanted to speak with me. Not Human Resources. Not Adrian. The board. The meeting would concern the circumstances of my termination, the North Star personnel schedule, and the company's authority records. My lawyer asked whether I would participate. Yes. Why? Because people who did not make this decision may still be damaged by it. That included our implementation team, the engineers, the project managers, the specialists whose annual bonuses depended partly on the North Star closing. It also included North Star employees who had spent months designing a transition around promises Verelion had made. I was not willing to rescue Adrian privately. I was willing to tell the truth in a process he did not control. The meeting was scheduled for 11. At 10:32, Adrian called again. This time, he left a voicemail. "Claire, this situation has escalated unnecessarily. We need to separate the employment matter from the client matter. Call me so we can handle this professionally." I listened twice. Not because the words were complicated, because he still believed the escalation had happened after the firing. It had happened inside it. The board call began with 4 directors, Priya, the chief financial officer, an outside lawyer, my attorney, and me. Adrian was not present. The chair of the Audit and Risk Committee, Evelyn Hart, spoke first. "Ms. Bennett, we are not asking you to provide privileged or proprietary information. We want to understand your assigned role and the timing of the employment decision." I described the North Star process, my written delegation, the personnel schedule, the Saturday session, the termination notice, the moment I stopped participating. Evelyn asked, "Did you advise North Star to suspend the deal?" "No." "Did you ask them to enforce the personnel schedule?" "No." "Did you communicate with them afterward?" "No." "Did you retain any company or customer documents?" "No." The outside lawyer asked whether I had known I would be terminated. I knew Adrian was angry that I would miss the dinner. I did not know he would end my employment during the call. Priya shared the authority timeline. At 8:38 Saturday night, Adrian had messaged the HR director instructing her to complete the termination immediately. At 8:42, HR generated the notice. At 8:47, it was delivered. At 8:49, Information Technology received the automatic instruction to disable my accounts. At 8:51, access ended. No one had informed General Counsel. No one had informed the Chief Financial Officer. No one had informed the Chief Operating Officer. No one had reviewed the North Star personnel schedule. The board asked why the termination happened on a Saturday night. Priya read Adrian's written explanation. Immediate action was necessary to address a continuing failure of executive alignment. Evelyn asked what incident had required immediate action. Priya answered carefully. Ms. Bennett declined to attend the anniversary dinner because of the North Star closing session. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then one director asked the question that changed the meeting. Was the chief executive aware she was in the North Star closing session? Yes. Was he aware of the potential contract value? Yes. Was he aware she was identified in the transition schedule? He approved the schedule, although we cannot establish whether he reviewed the personnel appendix in detail. The director leaned back. So the company removed a named transition leader during closing without counsel review because she attended the closing instead of the chief executive's dinner. Priya did not improve the sentence. Yes. That was when I understood the board was not calling to determine whether Adrian had been unkind. Boards do not usually remove executives because someone's feelings were hurt. They were determining whether the CEO had created material commercial risk through an impulsive employment decision. The dinner was embarrassing. The governance failure was dangerous. At the end of the call, Evelyn asked whether I would consider returning temporarily. To my former position? Yes. Reporting to Adrian? There was a pause. That would require discussion. Then my answer is no, the chief financial officer spoke. Claire, North Star has given us 5 days. I understand. This affects hundreds of employees. I understand that too. We are not asking you to waive what happened. You are asking me to step back into the structure that allowed it. Evelyn raised a hand. What arrangement would you consider? That was the first serious question anyone from Verelion had asked me since Saturday night. I looked at my lawyer. She nodded once. I would consider a limited independent engagement, I said. I would not return as Adrian's employee. What terms? I report to a board committee or another executive designated by the board. All authority is written. North Star is informed truthfully about my status. The client decides whether the arrangement satisfies its personnel requirements. Evelyn took notes. Compensation? My lawyer will provide a proposal. What else? The team assigned to North Star receives written protection from retaliation related to this incident. The chief financial officer shifted. That is broad. It can be drafted carefully. Anything else? The implementation team receives the retention pool management discussed and postponed twice. That pool has not been approved. Then approve it. Evelyn looked at me. You are negotiating for other employees. I am negotiating for the people who will still be here after I leave. Are you planning to leave? I was terminated. That decision has already been made. We could reverse it. You can reverse an entry in a system. You cannot reverse what it revealed. The call ended at 12:18. At 12:41, Adrian sent me a text. This has gone far enough. I read it. Then blocked his number. Not permanently, just until the people with actual authority decided what came next. That afternoon, Julian testified to the board committee. I did not attend, but he later told me what he said. Adrian had instructed him to take over North Star immediately. Julian had opened the negotiation archive and found more than 1,400 tracked decisions. Not emails, decisions. Each one showed the client request, Verelian's response, internal owner, financial impact, technical dependency, and final approved language. Julian understood sales. He also understood when pretending would become fraud. He told Adrian he could not represent himself as the architect of those decisions. Adrian accused him of lacking ambition. Julian answered, "Ambition is not the same as authority." That line reportedly ended the meeting. Julian then informed Priya that several executives had warned Adrian against firing me before the North Star signature. The HR director had asked whether legal should review the timing. Adrian said no. His assistant had reminded him that I was on the closing call. He said that made the absence worse because I had chosen the client over the leadership team. Those messages did not automatically establish that every part of the termination was unlawful. They established something more immediately relevant to the board. Adrian understood the business conflict. He simply believed the dinner mattered more. By Tuesday morning, the board removed him from all decisions related to North Star. The chief financial officer became interim executive sponsor. Priya received authority to negotiate my temporary engagement. Julian remained chief growth officer, but refused to be presented as my instant replacement. That decision saved his career. Possibly the company too. The proposal arrived Tuesday afternoon. Verelian wanted me for 6 months. 25 hours per week. A fixed consulting fee. A completion bonus if North Star signed. Direct reporting to the Audit and Risk Committee. Indemnification for authorized work. No obligation to report to Adrian. No authority to bind the company except as expressly stated. It was a respectable offer. I rejected it. Not because the money was too low. Because the authority section was vague. They wanted me responsible for resolving the deal while requiring 7 internal approvals before I could confirm whether a concession had been accepted. That was how companies created heroes when things worked, and scapegoats when they did not. I sent back 4 changes. First, Priya would issue a written authority matrix identifying exactly what I could negotiate and what required executive approval. Second, Verelian would appoint 1 executive decision-maker available during every closing session. Third, the North Star team would receive the retention pool before final signature, not afterward. Fourth, my engagement would end after 6 months whether Verelian had found a permanent replacement or not. They accepted 3. They resisted the retention pool. The chief financial officer called through my lawyer. We cannot pay a $1.2 million retention pool before revenue begins. You approved $3 million for a launch campaign. That budget is committed. So were these people. Claire, if the company needs the team to preserve a $184 million opportunity, the team is not an optional expense. The board approved $900,000. I asked for $1 million. We settled at $950,000. distributed according to role and workload, with no executive recipients. At 6:20 Tuesday evening, I signed the consulting agreement. Not from Varelian's office, from my lawyer's conference room. I received a new email address, clearly identifying me as an independent transition advisor. North Star received formal notice. They requested an interview and confirmation of my authority. They did not automatically accept me simply because they knew me. That was the point of their process. At 9 o'clock Wednesday morning, Elaine, Daniel, Priya, the interim sponsor, and I joined a call. Daniel asked one question first. "Are you participating voluntarily?" "Yes." "Do you have authority to complete the schedules?" "Within the written matrix provided to you." "Who resolves matters outside it?" "Priya for legal issues and the interim sponsor for commercial approval." "Does Mr. Cole retain authority over this negotiation?" Priya answered. "No." Elaine nodded. "Then we can resume." The resumed negotiation was not triumphant. It was exhausting. North Star reopened the governance section because Adrian's decision had exposed a real concern. What happened if Varelian changed leadership during implementation? We added continuity procedures, defined approval backups, required current authority lists, created a transition council with representatives from both organizations. North Star requested a clearer escalation route if one executive overrode an approved implementation decision. Varelian resisted, then stopped resisting. The contract became stronger because the crisis forced both sides to address a weakness they had previously treated as theoretical. On Thursday afternoon, we completed the personnel schedule. I remained transition advisor for 6 months. Our implementation vice president became the permanent executive lead. Julian served as commercial sponsor but not operational approver. A senior program director I had trained became my designated successor. North Star interviewed her, asked difficult questions, approved her. That mattered more to me than being listed first. An irreplaceable employee is often evidence of a badly designed system. I did not want Varelian permanently dependent on me. I wanted it incapable of pretending a responsible transition could happen in one angry email. At 4:36 Friday afternoon, Daniel circulated the final documents. The interim executive sponsor signed for Varelian. Elaine signed for North Star. I did not sign the master agreement. It was not mine to sign. I confirmed the approved transition schedules under the authority granted in my consulting engagement. At 4:52, the completed transaction appeared in both parties' document systems. $184 million over 7 years. The largest agreement in Varelian's history. The chief financial officer called. "It's done." "Yes." There was a long silence. "I'm sorry," he said. "For the firing? For knowing Adrian was angry and assuming someone else would stop him." That apology meant more than the polished statement Human Resources later sent. Most corporate failures are not created by one powerful person. They are created by several reasonable people who each expect another reasonable person to intervene. Adrian remained CEO for another 11 days. The board had placed him on leave while outside counsel reviewed the decision, the authority failure, and whether he had concealed the North Star risk when reporting to directors. He requested one conversation with me. My lawyer advised against it. I agreed only because Priya attended. He appeared on screen from his home office. The dining room was visible behind him, the same room where the anniversary dinner had taken place. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he said, "You made your point." I was not making a point. I was closing the agreement. "You could have called me that night. You terminated my authority that night. You knew what I meant. A client cannot rely on what you meant. Neither can a board." His jaw tightened. This did not need to become a governance crisis. No, it did not. You could have attended the dinner. I could not attend both. You chose North Star. I chose the obligation you assigned me. He leaned back. It was one dinner. It was one contract closing. You always reduce leadership to documents, and you reduced it to attendance, Priya interrupted, before either of us moved further. Adrian looked down at his desk. Then he asked the question I think he had been carrying since Saturday. Was missing that dinner worth all this? No, I said. The dinner was never worth all this. He looked up. You confused your table with the company. That was our final conversation. Adrian resigned before the board completed its review. The announcement thanked him for his vision, energy, and contribution to Verelian's growth. It did not mention the dinner. Corporate statements rarely mention the small decision that exposes the larger problem. The HR director kept her position, but no longer reported directly to the CEO. Major terminations involving client-facing executives required legal and operational review. The board created an authority register for significant negotiations. Julian remained Chief Growth Officer. He became better after the crisis, less eager to be seen as the person with every answer, more willing to ask who had done the work before entering the room. The senior program director I trained became North Star's permanent transition lead. She completed the first 8 hospital deployments ahead of the revised schedule. The retention pool helped Verelian keep the core team together. North Star's contract did not transform Verelian overnight. There were still difficult launches, disagreements, budget pressure, missed assumptions. But the company had a structure strong enough to address those problems without depending on one person's memory. I completed my 6-month engagement. On my final day, Verelian offered me a permanent position as Chief Commercial Strategy Officer. More money, a board presentation, a larger team. I declined, not bitterly. I had simply learned that being essential to a company was not the same as being safe inside it. 3 months later, I opened a small advisory practice, helping technology companies prepare complex agreements for the moment after the signature. Not sales consulting, promise consulting. I help clients identify who owns each commitment, what authority each person holds, what happens when leadership changes, and whether the business can deliver the story its executives are telling. Verelian became my second client. North Star referred the third. The dinner invitation remained in my personal calendar for months because I had forgotten to delete it. Founder's Table, an evening of leadership and gratitude. Every time it appeared in a search, I remembered the empty chair Adrian had treated as a personal insult. He believed leadership meant being present at his table. I believed it meant being present when your promise was tested. The largest deal he ever chased eventually closed. The implementation succeeded, the team stayed, the client received a stronger agreement, and Adrian was not present for the signature, not because I removed him, because one Saturday night he fired the person closing his largest deal to punish an empty chair. Then he discovered that the chair had never been the valuable part. If you have ever been expected to choose between performing loyalty and doing the work you were hired to do, share what you would have done below, and subscribe for more original stories about workplace betrayal, professional boundaries, documentation, and lawful corporate accountability.